Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining my keynote today. My talk today is going to focus on Core 5, an industrial grade family of open source RISC V cores. And these cores are being developed within an organization called the Open Hardware Group. Before we get into the cores specifically and the work in the Open Hardware Group, let's review some of the barriers that exist today in the industry as far as adoption of open source hardware-based IP is concerned. Our software colleagues have long solved this problem with many strong examples of open source software being adopted commercially and in widespread use across the industry. But on the hardware side, we've really yet to crack this nut, if you will, and use open source hardware-based IP in high volume production chips or systems in the hardware industry. And why is that? Well, there's three main barriers to that adoption. One is IP quality. Are you going to bet your badge, walk into your boss's office and bet your badge on a piece of IP that you downloaded off a GitHub repo that was put up by a strong team from a university and use that in a production device? On the ecosystem side, what kind of a roadmap exists for this IP? And what does the software tool chain look like? Will you be able to get the support long-term that is required and needed in many of these systems where this IP would be adopted? And lastly, but certainly not least, are the legal implications. What kind of licensing model are we talking about for these cores? And how will a large commercial organization take advantage of using these cores or this IP in high volume production SoCs? A key enabler to the open source hardware movement has been the availability of the free and open RISC V ISA. It's really unleashing a new frontier of innovation at the processor level. And this is fantastic. But how many open source processor cores does the industry really need? How many implementations can we really support? From a pedagogical standpoint, having lots of cores out there is interesting and they're great teaching tools. But from a long-term viability and adoption standpoint, how do we achieve critical mass around a handful of open source cores that can be used effectively in the hardware industry? As illustrated here on this slide, we have a number of open source cores, as you can see on the risc5.org site. And while this slide is an older slide, or this list here is an older list, it's illustrative in the fact that there are many cores. And you can make a very strong argument that too many cores is a bad thing from an adoption and support, long-term viability and support standpoint. So what we're focused on here in the Open Hardware Group is a family of cores out of ETH Zurich under the Pulp platform led by Luca Benini that are written in System Verilog and are gaining widespread adoption and commercial support by the ecosystem. So the Open Hardware Group is a nonprofit organization that has been put in place to try to solve these barriers to adoption. And in particular, an environment where hardware and software developers can collaborate on open source IP, the tool chain, and resultant ecosystem. And in particular for a family of open source RISC V cores, which we call the Core 5 family. We have developers throughout the world in North America, Europe, and Asia with a broad spectrum of support across industry and academia. And what we're really working on is hosting high quality industrial grade IP that can be trusted and used in high volume production SoCs. We have a large number of members and partners with over 58 and growing at this stage across the ecosystem, including very large systems companies and chip companies, tool chain companies, simulation companies, software companies, quite a broad spectrum of support throughout the ecosystem. On the research side, we have a number of institutions that are leveraging the work that we're doing for research platforms and initiatives within their schools, and a very healthy stable of partners that are helping us with their tools to enable these open source artifacts as we bring them to the ecosystem. The technical working group is the organization that I'm going to focus on within the open hardware group for the rest of this talk. So open hardware is governed by a board of directors, and under the board of directors are two main working groups, a technical working group and a marketing working group. And within the technical working group, we have a number of task groups that execute the projects that we have underway. So the technical working group is chaired by Sebastian Ahmed from Silicon Labs and Jerry Zhang from NXP. And this is really the R&D of the organization, where they oversee all of the task groups that drive the projects. And from an engineering standpoint, we use the Eclipse development process as our engineering release methodology. The Eclipse development process is well proven for the Eclipse IDE, has been in place for many years, and we have a strong partnership with the Eclipse Foundation to deliver these artifacts. So the cores task group is where the Core 5 family of cores resides. The RTL is owned, if you will, by this group, this task group, and the functionality that's in the cores is defined and driven by this group. The chair is Arjan Bink from Silicon Labs, and the vice chair is Jérôme Guérin from Thales. And this team, as I said, is responsible for the Core 5 family of cores, which came from the ETH Zurich team on the Pulp platform group. So in particular, the RISC core, which we call the CVE4, is a family of 4-stage embedded cores. And the Ariane family, which we call the CVA6, is a family of 32-bit and 64-bit application class 6-stage cores capable of running Linux. Beyond the cores themselves and the work in the cores task group is a task group responsible for the verification of the IP blocks that we develop. And this is of particular importance when you consider what we're working on is to develop high quality industry grade IP. The verification task group is led by Leo Wang from FutureWay Technologies and Steve Richmond from Silicon Labs. And their mandate in this task group is to build a best-in-class verification test bench for the open source IP that we develop within the open hardware group. And as you can see here in the verification test bench, this is a UVM-based environment. We use the RISC V random instruction generator from Google, and we to drive test programs into the tool chain. And what's interesting here is the test programs are run simultaneously on the device under test, the core itself, as well as a reference model from Imperis. And this is a step and compare based methodology where the retire of each instruction, we compare the program counters and status registers in both the model and the RTL for a match before proceeding on with the rest of the execution of the program. So this is a nice, robust environment that is producing high quality coverage for our cores. And here's an example of coverage reports, which we put on our GitHub repos and publish publicly. You can scrutinize the quality and audit the coverage that we're achieving from a code coverage standpoint, a functional coverage standpoint, FSM, assertion coverage, and determine for yourself the quality level that this group has achieved. On the ecosystem standpoint, we have a software task group and a hardware task group. So I'll begin with the software task group, which is chaired by Jeremy Bennett from Embecosm, and the vice chair is Yunhai Shang from Alibaba. And this team is responsible for defining and executing on the software tools, IDE, operating system ports, and so on to support the cores that we're developing. And one example project is the Core 5 IDE, which is leveraging the Eclipse CDT to create an IDE bring-up environment for our Core 5 family of cores. We've integrated the GCC toolchain, and LLVM toolchain will be integrated as well. We support OpenOCD from a debug standpoint. And the idea here is we'll have examples and bring up environments to run on our FPGA boards, which I'll talk about in a moment, and getting started guide as well. This is quite an interesting part of the open hardware group, and if you're interested in this, please join us. The hardware task group is chaired by Hugh Pollitt-Smith from CMC Microsystems and Tim Sachs from QuickLogic. And the charter there is to define and develop SoCs and FPGA platforms where our cores will be used alongside the software work that I just mentioned to have a complete bring-up environment for these cores. So one of the projects is having a bring-up environment on the Genesis 2 FPGA platform from our partner at Digilent. And this platform is used because we can fit smaller cores like the CVE4 as well as clusters of larger cores, such as the application class 6-stage cores, the CVA6. An interesting project underway within the cores task group is Core 5 MCU SoC that we're taping out in the first quarter. And this is a production grade SoC that will be built in GlobalFoundries 22FDX that will have embedded FPGA from QuickLogic attached to the CVE4 embedded class 4-stage core. So it's a compelling MCU that will be able to demonstrate a full range of capability of that core and leverage the software tool chain work that's been done as well. Part of the philosophy within the Open Hardware Group is that we not only work on the RTL, industry-grade verification of that RTL, and the tools to support those cores, but also take the work to integrating those cores into a full SoC with physical design and a modern geometry node, and then build out eval kits associated with these cores and SoCs, so that you get the experience that you would expect to see from a full commercial offering from an IP company. So what's next? Well, here's a few predictions. We'll be well over 60 members and partners by the end of the year. We're just a little over a year old now, so that's some pretty impressive growth. We'll have a number of new cores added to the Core 5 family to flesh out the roadmap of open source RISC V cores. We'll have projects underway for on-chip SoC interconnect, both fabric and bus level work, as well as support for heterogeneous clusters with accelerators built in and leveraging embedded FPGA. So please join us on social media, follow along with the projects that we're working on, and we'd encourage you to participate as a member and join and help drive these projects. Also later this week at the RISC V Summit on Thursday at noontime Pacific, you can tune into a 60-minute long talk on the Core 5 Veris test bench, which is the industrial grade verification work that we've been doing. And that talk is going to be given by Mike Thompson from the Open Hardware Group, Sven Beyer from OneSpin, and Steve Richmond from Silicon Labs. Also tune in to the Open Hardware Group virtual booth, where we'll have demos in the booth from CMC, in Paris, Metrics, OneSpin, and QuickLogic, all related to the activity underway within the Core 5 family of open source RISC V cores. So this is an exciting time. Please join us and participate in these projects to help drive the future of open source hardware. Thank you.